My name is Sarah Martinez, and at 34 years old, I thought I had finally found my calling as a travel photographer. That Tuesday morning in November, while editing photos from my recent expedition to the remote mountains of Nepal, I received a phone call that would validate everything I had been fighting for. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Rebecca Chen from National Geographic, and she wanted to discuss featuring my work in their upcoming issue on disappearing cultures. As I listened to her praise my photography and storytelling abilities, I couldn't help but think about the conversation I'd had with my family just 6 months earlier, when they told me I was wasting my life chasing dreams that would never pay the bills. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, I was always the odd one out in the Rodriguez-Martinez household. My father, Miguel, was a successful insurance agent who had built his business from nothing, working 16-hour days to provide for his family. My mother, Carmen, was a devoted homemaker who had given up her teaching career to raise my older brother David and me. David, 3 years my senior, had followed perfectly in our father's footsteps, graduating with a business degree and joining the family insurance agency immediately after college. From as early as I can remember, I was fascinated by the world beyond our planned community, with its identical houses and manicured lawns. While David collected baseball cards and played video games, I spent hours poring over National Geographic magazines at the library, dreaming of the exotic places and fascinating people featured in their pages. I saved every penny from my allowance to buy disposable cameras, much to my parents' bewilderment, and filled album after album with photographs of anything that caught my eye. My parents viewed my interest in photography as a harmless hobby, something I would eventually outgrow as I matured and developed more practical interests. They had mapped out my future with the same careful planning they applied to everything else in their lives. I would study business in college, join the family agency, marry a nice local boy, and raise their grandchildren nearby. The idea that their daughter might want something entirely different never seriously entered their minds. During high school, I threw myself into photography with increasing passion. I joined the school newspaper, won several local photography contests, and spent my weekends exploring Phoenix and the surrounding desert with my camera. My photography teacher, Mrs. Patterson, recognized something special in my work and encouraged me to consider pursuing it seriously. She helped me apply for photography scholarships and even arranged for me to shadow a professional photographer for a week during spring break. When I excitedly shared this opportunity with my parents over dinner, the reaction was not what I had hoped for. My father set down his fork and fixed me with the stern look I knew meant serious business. "Sarah, photography is a nice hobby, but it's not a career. Do you know how many people try to make a living with a camera? Most of them end up waiting tables to pay rent. You're too smart to waste your talents on something so uncertain." My mother nodded in agreement, her expression filled with concern. "We've seen what happens to people who chase these artistic dreams, Misha. They struggle their whole lives, never able to provide for their families properly. We want security for you, not constant worry about money." David, who had been quietly eating, looked up with what I can only describe as condescending sympathy. "Sarah, I get it. The whole adventure thing seems exciting when you're 17, but real life isn't like those magazines you read. Real life requires stability, health insurance, retirement planning. Photography might be fun now, but what happens when you're 40 and still living paycheck to paycheck?" Despite their objections, I was determined to shadow the photographer Mrs. Patterson had arranged for me to meet. Maria Gonzalez was a freelance photojournalist who specialized in documenting social issues throughout the American Southwest. Spending a week with her opened my eyes to possibilities I had never imagined. She showed me how photography could be more than just capturing beautiful images. It could tell stories, raise awareness, and create meaningful change in the world. Maria's work took her to homeless encampments, immigrant communities, and Native American reservations. Through her lens, she captured the dignity and resilience of people who were often overlooked or misunderstood by mainstream society. Watching her work, I realized that photography wasn't just about technical skill or artistic vision, it was about empathy, curiosity, and the courage to venture into unfamiliar territory. On my last day shadowing Maria, she pulled me aside for a serious conversation. "You have a natural eye for composition and storytelling," she told me as we reviewed the photos I had taken throughout the week. "But more importantly, you have the curiosity and fearlessness that good photojournalists need. If you're serious about this path, you need to understand that it won't be easy. The work is unpredictable, the pay can be inconsistent, and you'll face constant pressure from people who think you should choose something more conventional." I listened intently as she continued. "But if you're willing to work hard, take risks, and persist through rejection and criticism, you can create work that matters. The question is whether you're prepared to fight for what you believe in, even when the people closest to you don't understand." Her words resonated deeply with me, though I wasn't fully prepared for just how prescient they would prove to be. When I returned home and shared my experiences with Maria, my family's reaction was even more negative than I had anticipated. They saw my enthusiasm as confirmation that I was being led astray by unrealistic fantasies about life as a photographer. "This Maria person is filling your head with nonsense," my father declared. "She's probably struggling to make ends meet herself and wants company in her misery. You're going to throw away your future because some photographer convinced you that taking pictures is meaningful work." My mother was gentler but no less discouraging. "Sweetheart, we understand that you enjoyed this experience, but you need to think practically. What kind of life would that be?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"These are beautiful pictures, Mija," my mother admitted, "but what are you going to do with them? How do they help you build a career?" My father was more blunt. "You've spent thousands of dollars and risked your safety to create a nice photo album. I still don't see how this translates into a stable income or a secure future." Even David, who I could tell was impressed by the technical quality of my work, remained skeptical about its practical value. "I'm not saying you're not talented, Sarah. Obviously you are. But talent doesn't guarantee success in a field this competitive. Are you prepared for the reality that you might spend years struggling to make a living, regardless of how good your work is?" Their skepticism was demoralizing, but it also strengthened my resolve. I spent my remaining college years building a portfolio that showcased my range and developing the business skills I would need to succeed as a freelance photographer. I interned with local newspapers and magazines, assisted established photographers, and gradually began accepting small assignments on my own. By the time I graduated, I had already published work in several regional publications and had established relationships with editors who appreciated my eye for storytelling. My senior portfolio, which focused on immigrant communities in Phoenix, earned recognition from the university and caught the attention of a photo editor at a major magazine. The job offer came from Southwest Life magazine, a regional publication that covered culture, politics, and social issues throughout the American Southwest. It wasn't National Geographic, but it was a real job with benefits, regular assignments, and the opportunity to continue developing my skills as a photojournalist. When I shared the news with my family, their reaction was mixed. They were relieved that I had found employment in my field, but they remained concerned about the long-term prospects and stability of a career in photography. "It's a start," my father conceded, "but what happens if the magazine downsizes or goes out of business? The media industry is changing so rapidly. How do you know this job will be there in 5 years?" My mother focused on the practical details. "What's the salary like? Do they provide good health insurance? Are you going to be traveling a lot for work? I still worry about you going to dangerous places alone." David, who had recently been promoted to a senior position at the family agency, couldn't resist making comparisons. "I'm glad you found something, but let's be realistic about what this means. You're starting at the bottom of an industry that's shrinking. Meanwhile, if you had joined the agency, you'd already be making twice as much money and building toward ownership." Despite their reservations, I was thrilled to begin my career as a professional photographer. The work at Southwest Life was challenging and varied, taking me throughout Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and California to document everything from environmental issues to cultural celebrations. I covered water rights disputes in rural communities, photographed traditional craft makers preserving ancient techniques, and documented the impact of urban development on desert ecosystems. Each assignment taught me something new about both photography and the world around me. I learned to work quickly and efficiently under pressure, to build trust with subjects who might be wary of media attention, and to find compelling visual stories in situations that might seem mundane to others. My work at the magazine was well received by editors and readers, and I began to develop a reputation for sensitive, thoughtful documentary photography. After 2 years, I was promoted to senior photographer and given more freedom to pursue long-term projects that aligned with my interests and the magazine's mission. It was during this period that I began to seriously consider pursuing more international work. The stories I was covering in the Southwest were important and meaningful, but I found myself drawn to the broader global issues that had first inspired my interest in photojournalism. Climate change, cultural preservation, and human migration were not just regional concerns, they were global phenomena that required broader documentation and awareness. The opportunity I had been waiting for came through an unexpected connection. Professor Williams, who had remained a mentor throughout my early career, reached out to tell me about a photographer friend who was organizing an expedition to document traditional cultures in the Himalayas. The project was ambitious and challenging, requiring significant physical endurance and cultural sensitivity, but it offered the chance to create work that could have real impact on conservation and cultural preservation efforts. The catch was that the expedition was self-funded. Participants were responsible for covering their own travel expenses, equipment costs, and living expenses for the 3-month journey. The total cost would be substantial, requiring me to use most of my savings and take on additional debt. When I called my family to discuss the opportunity, their reaction was swift and overwhelmingly negative. The conversation started calmly enough, but quickly escalated as they realized I was seriously considering leaving my stable job to pursue what they saw as an expensive and risky adventure. "Sarah, this is insanity," my father said, his voice rising with frustration. "You finally have a real job with benefits and regular pay, and you want to throw it all away to go mountain climbing with a camera. Do you understand how irresponsible this sounds?" My mother was equally alarmed. 3 months in the mountains, what if something happens to you? What if you get altitude sickness or injured, and what happens to your job while you're gone? Are they just going to hold your position for you while you play adventurer? David's reaction was the most cutting. I had documented communities and traditions that few outsiders had ever seen, creating a visual record that could contribute to preservation and awareness efforts. The question that haunted me during the long flights home was whether any of it would matter to the people I cared about most. Would my family be able to see the value in what I had accomplished, or would they only focus on the risks I had taken and the conventions I had ignored? Returning to Phoenix after 3 months in the Himalayas felt like entering a foreign country. The endless strip malls, the relentless desert heat, and the familiar rhythm of suburban life seemed almost surreal after months of mountain silence and ancient villages. I had expected some adjustment period, but I wasn't prepared for how profoundly the experience had changed my perspective on everything I had once considered normal. My apartment felt cramped and sterile compared to the simple mountain homes where I had been welcomed as a guest. The abundance of material possessions that had once seemed necessary now felt overwhelming and unnecessary. Most challenging of all was the knowledge that I had created work that mattered, work that documented disappearing worlds and told stories that needed to be told, but I had no clear path forward for sharing it with the world. The initial reception of my Himalayan photographs was mixed and frustrating. Southwest Life magazine, where I had hoped to return to my staff position, had filled my role during my absence and could only offer me freelance assignments at reduced rates. The editor who had been supportive of my expedition had left for another publication, and his replacement viewed my extended absence as evidence of unreliability rather than dedication to the craft. My first meeting back at the magazine was uncomfortable and deflating. The new editor, James Morrison, was a practical man in his 50s who had built his career on consistent, predictable content that served the magazine's advertising partners. He flipped through my portfolio with professional politeness but obvious skepticism about its commercial value. "These are technically impressive," he admitted, pausing at a portrait of an elderly weaver in a remote Nepalese village. "But I'm not sure our readership is interested in stories about people they'll never meet and places they'll never visit. We need content that speaks to life in the Southwest, issues that directly affect our subscribers." I tried to explain the broader relevance of the work, connecting the stories of climate adaptation in the Himalayas to similar challenges facing communities in Arizona and New Mexico. But Morrison was focused on practical concerns about budget, space, and reader engagement. He offered me a few small assignments covering local arts festivals and municipal meetings, work that felt trivial after documenting ancient cultures in transition. The freelance lifestyle proved more challenging than I had anticipated. Without the security of a staff position, I found myself constantly hustling for assignments, dealing with inconsistent income, and struggling to find outlets for the work I was most passionate about creating. The Himalayan photographs, which I considered my best and most important work, seemed to have no commercial market in the regional publications that had previously supported my career. During this period of professional uncertainty, the strain on my family relationships intensified. My parents and brother had hoped that my struggles to find stable work would validate their concerns about my career choices and motivate me to consider more conventional alternatives. Instead, my determination to succeed as a photographer seemed to increase, which they interpreted as stubborn pride rather than professional commitment. The tension came to a head during a family barbecue at my parents' house in early fall. David had just purchased a new house in an upscale Scottsdale neighborhood, and the conversation naturally turned to real estate prices, mortgage rates, and investment strategies. I sat quietly, feeling increasingly disconnected from discussions about market trends and retirement planning. "Sarah should think about buying something soon," my mother suggested, trying to include me in the conversation. "The market won't stay favorable forever, and she's not getting any younger." My father nodded thoughtfully. "It's difficult to qualify for a mortgage without steady employment, but there might be programs for freelancers. The key is showing consistent income over time." David, who had been describing the features of his new house with obvious pride, turned to me with what seemed like genuine concern. "Have you thought seriously about your long-term financial security? I know you love photography, but at some point you need to consider practical realities. What happens when you're 50 and still chasing assignments? What happens if you get sick or injured and can't work?" I tried to explain that I was building a career, not just pursuing assignments randomly, but my family struggled to understand the difference. To them, freelance work seemed inherently unstable and unreliable, regardless of the quality or importance of the output. "I'm not just taking random pictures," I said, feeling defensive despite my efforts to stay calm. "I'm documenting important stories about cultural preservation and environmental change. The work I did in the Himalayas could contribute to conservation efforts and raise awareness about communities that are rarely represented in mainstream media." My father's expression grew skeptical. "But who's paying you for this awareness raising? Who's compensating you for documenting these disappearing cultures? Good intentions don't pay rent or provide health insurance." My mother tried to soften the conversation, but her concerns were equally pointed. "We're proud of your artistic abilities, Misha. Your photographs are beautiful. But we want to see you build a life that includes more than just work. Don't you want a partner, a family of your own? How do you expect to meet someone while you're constantly traveling to remote places? When are you going to find a way to turn this talent into real income?" My father was more direct in his criticism. "You're like a talented musician who only plays in coffee shops. Everyone says you're great, but you're still struggling to make rent. At some point, talent has to translate into success, or it's just an expensive hobby." David, who had recently been promoted again and was considering expanding his own family, positioned himself as the voice of mature pragmatism. "I'm not saying your work isn't good. Obviously it is. But good isn't enough if you can't build a sustainable business around it. Maybe it's time to consider photography as a side project, while you develop something more reliable as your primary income." Their concerns weren't entirely unreasonable. I was 35 years old and still living paycheck to paycheck, dependent on unpredictable freelance assignments and occasional grant funding. I had no retirement savings, minimal health insurance, and no clear path toward the kind of financial stability that would allow me to plan for the future. The stress of constant financial uncertainty was affecting my work and my health. I found myself taking on commercial assignments that I resented, photographing events and subjects that held no interest for me simply because they paid well. The corporate photography that had once seemed like a reasonable supplement to my editorial work was beginning to dominate my schedule and creative energy. During this period of mounting pressure and self-doubt, I received an unexpected phone call from Maria Gonzalez, the photojournalist who had mentored me during high school. She had been following my career through mutual connections in social media, and she wanted to discuss a project that might align with my interests and skills. Maria had been commissioned by a European foundation to document indigenous communities throughout the Americas that were developing innovative responses to climate change. The project would require extensive travel over 2 years, visiting communities from Alaska to Argentina. The compensation was modest but reliable, and the work would result in a book, traveling exhibition, and digital archive. I need someone with your combination of technical skill and cultural sensitivity, Maria explained during our conversation. This isn't just about taking beautiful pictures. It's about understanding and respecting communities that have been exploited by researchers and journalists in the past. Your work in Nepal shows me you have the patience and ethics this project requires. The opportunity was exactly what I had been hoping for, meaningful work that would contribute to important conversations about environmental adaptation and indigenous knowledge, supported by reliable funding and prestigious institutional backing. It would also require me to commit to 2 years of almost constant travel, living out of hotels and temporary accommodations while building relationships with communities across 2 continents. When I shared the opportunity with my family, their reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. The conversation took place during Sunday dinner at my parents' house, a weekly tradition that had become increasingly uncomfortable as my career struggles intensified. 2 years of traveling around taking pictures of people in remote places, my father summarized after I finished describing the project. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of thing we've been worried about. You're 35 years old. When are you going to stop running around the world and start building a real life? My mother's concerns focused on the practical and personal costs of such extensive travel. How are you supposed to maintain any kind of relationship if you're never in one place for more than a few weeks? What happens to your apartment, your friendships, your health insurance, and what happens when this project ends in 2 years and you're back to scrambling for freelance work? David's reaction was the most direct and hurtful. He set down his fork and looked at me with an expression that combined frustration, disappointment, and genuine concern. I think you're addicted to this lifestyle, Sarah. I think you can't handle the responsibility and compromise that comes with staying in one place and building something lasting. He paused, perhaps expecting me to argue, then continued. This isn't about following your dreams anymore. This is about running away from adult responsibilities. While other people our age are buying houses, starting families, and building careers that contribute to their communities, you're chasing after some fantasy of being an important photographer. The accusation that I was avoiding adult responsibilities stung because it touched on insecurities I had been grappling with privately. Was my commitment to documentary photography actually a sophisticated form of escapism? Was I using the noble mission of cross-cultural storytelling to avoid the messier challenges of building lasting relationships and establishing roots? But I also knew that the work Maria was offering represented everything I had been training for throughout my career. The opportunity to document indigenous responses to climate change could contribute to policy discussions, conservation efforts, and broader public understanding of environmental challenges. It was exactly the kind of project that justified all the risks and sacrifices I had made in pursuit of a photography career. This isn't about running away, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotional intensity of the conversation. This is about contributing to important conversations about climate adaptation and indigenous knowledge. The work could influence policy decisions and conservation strategies. My father's skepticism was evident in his response. Important to whom? Most challenging was the realization that completing such a significant project hadn't resolved the fundamental tensions in my relationship with my family, or provided the financial security that might have validated my career choices in their eyes. The work had enhanced my reputation and opened new opportunities, but it hadn't transformed my economic situation in ways that would satisfy their concerns about stability and practicality. The months following my return from the Americas project were marked by a strange combination of professional recognition and personal emptiness. My work was being featured in galleries and publications worldwide, yet I found myself questioning whether the sacrifices had been worth it. I was 37 years old, living alone in a small apartment, with savings that barely covered 6 months of expenses despite years of critical acclaim. The breakthrough came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in November when my phone rang with an unknown number. Rebecca Chen from National Geographic was calling about my Indigenous Climate Adaptation series. She had seen the work at a photography conference and wanted to discuss a potential collaboration. "Your approach to documenting these communities is exactly what we're looking for," she explained. "We're developing a major feature on global climate resilience, and your work captures both the human stories and the broader environmental context we need." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, as Rebecca outlined their vision for a comprehensive story that would span multiple issues of the magazine. They wanted to license my existing photographs and commission additional work to complete the narrative. The financial terms she mentioned were more generous than anything I had ever been offered. "We'd also like to discuss the possibility of you joining our contributing photographer roster," she added. "Your expertise in cultural documentation and environmental storytelling aligns perfectly with our editorial priorities." After we hung up, I sat in stunned silence, hardly believing that the call I had dreamed about since childhood had actually happened. National Geographic wanted my work. They saw value in the path I had chosen, the risks I had taken, and the stories I had dedicated my life to telling. The formal offer arrived within a week, outlining terms that would provide both immediate financial relief and long-term career stability. The initial licensing fees alone would cover my expenses for the next year, and the contributing photographer arrangement would provide steady assignments and reliable income. My first instinct was to call my family and share the news, but our relationship remained strained from my decision to pursue the Americas project. Instead, I reached out to Maria Gonzalez, who had become both mentor and friend throughout my career journey. "I told you this day would come," she said, her voice filled with genuine pride. "You never compromised your vision, and now you're being recognized by the most prestigious platform in our field. This is what happens when you stay true to your artistic integrity." The validation from someone I respected professionally was deeply meaningful, but I knew that the conversation with my family would be more complicated. They had spent years watching me struggle financially while pursuing what they saw as an impractical dream. Would this success change their perspective, or would they see it as a fortunate accident rather than vindication of my choices? I decided to visit them in person to share the news. The drive to their house gave me time to consider how to approach the conversation. I wanted them to understand that this opportunity represented more than just financial success. It was recognition of the value in work they had long dismissed as impractical. My parents were surprised to see me arrive unannounced, but they welcomed me warmly despite the tension that had marked our recent interactions. David was there for Sunday dinner with his wife and 2 young children, creating the kind of family gathering that had once made me feel excluded from their version of success. "I have some news to share," I began, pulling out my phone to show them the National Geographic website where one of my photographs had already been featured. "They're going to publish a major story using my work from the Americas project." The reaction was immediate but complex. My mother gasped and covered her mouth with her hands, clearly recognizing the significance of National Geographic's recognition. My father leaned forward to examine the photograph more closely, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching admiration. David's response was more measured. "That's impressive, Sarah. Really impressive. What does this mean practically? Are they paying you well for the work?" When I explained the financial terms and the contributing photographer opportunity, the atmosphere in the room changed noticeably. My parents exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their reassessment of my career choices. "National Geographic," my mother repeated, shaking her head in amazement. "I used to read those magazines when you were little. I never imagined my daughter's pictures would be in them." My father's response revealed the depth of his previous concerns and his genuine relief at this development. "I won't lie to you, Sarah. I was worried that you were throwing your life away on something that would never provide security. I'm glad to be proven wrong."